all the buildings that you see around us here, including this building right here, were all date back to the years of 1740, or they were all built between the years of 1740 and 1786. That's when the most powerful, the most well-known, and certainly the most historic Prussian king sat on the throne. A man who would rule Prussia for 46 years. That man right up there on his horse, a man by the name of Frederick II, also referred to as Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was a brilliant military strategist that would bring large territorial gains here to the Kingdom of Prussia, and he would also be the one Prussian king that would really plant the foundations of Prussian imperialism that would be achieved then in 1871 with the unification of the country. He was also the Prussian king who was the most obsessed with building. And so as we are now standing right here in this very spot, amid all the buildings that he had commissioned to be built, we're now standing in an area called Frederick's Forum. And today, probably the most prominent would be this one right here. First, this building, dating back to the 1770s, was built as a palace for Frederick the Great's younger brother, a man by the name of Prince Henry. But in 1810, this was converted into Berlin's very first university, called the Humboldt University. And the Humboldt University today, since 1810, has seen a lot of famous names come out of it. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the fathers of communism, they were students over here at the Humboldt. Otto von Bismarck, a very important name in German history. He was the architect of that unification in 1871, becoming Germany's very first chancellor. He too was a student. The fairy tale brothers, Joachim and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers Grimm, they were students here at the Humboldt. But certainly one of the most renowned names to come out of the Humboldt University was Albert Einstein, who taught here during the 1920s. Now, it was in 1932 that Einstein was offered a full-time teaching job at Princeton University in the United States, and this was a job that he would gladly accept immediately. As it was in July of 1932 that the Nazis would become the largest party in Germany. This is when they would have the most representation in the Reichstag, the Parliament building just blocks away from here. They would really start to play a very influential role politically. And as many of you know, Albert Einstein was Jewish, and so therefore, for obvious reasons, that is to avoid getting his life turned upside down by the Nazis. He stayed in America. He was on sabbatical at that time in America, but he ended up staying there in America, never coming back here to his home country of Germany. Coming back to the university itself, no fewer than 28 Nobel Prize winners have come out of the Humboldt University. And today, this is the university has hundreds and hundreds of international students who come here, many different disciplines, many different subjects that one can study here at the Humboldt. Now, just across the way here, just to point out finally, back here in 1933, this is one of the most infamous squares here in Berlin, just across the street. Amid all these beautiful buildings that really capture a very vibrant royal presence here in this part of town, the square across the street by far one of the most infamous. That's because back in 1933, just after the Nazis came to power and just after they installed that dictatorship, that the propaganda ministry of the Third Reich coordinated a nationwide book-burning event that took place in all major university cities throughout Germany. On that evening of May 10th, 1933, students from the National Socialist Students Organization and other Nazi fanatics went on the other side of the Brandenburg Gate into one of Berlin's largest parks, the Tiergarten, a library that was being run by a homosexual Jew called Magnus Hirschfeld, a direct target of the Nazis. They went into that library, they looted through that library and grabbed around 10,000 books from that library. They then went to other libraries around town, including the Royal Library situated just across the street here, and would grab an additional 10,000 books. For a grand total of around 20,000 books, and brought them right out here to the middle of this square, the square that we're standing right across from today, put them right into a pile and incinerated them. Now this was work that the Nazis considered to be un-German for the Nazi period, or work that was made by anyone who the Nazis saw as unfit or un-German for the Nazi period. That is anyone or anything that compromised aspects of the Nazi ideology of strength, determination, order, and racial purity. These words that the Nazis used over and around. On that evening, work by Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, copies of course here in Berlin, all completely destroyed. After the First World War, there's a very large anti-war sentiment that had sprung up. So it was very common for authors to write about peace, about the futility of war. So a book such as All Quiet on the Western Front, which I'm sure is a book that many of you are familiar with, that would have been a book that was burnt that evening, as well as work by Ernest Hemingway. But the group of individuals that really bore the brunt of having their work destroyed were indeed Jewish authors. Judith authors here, big names like Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Heinrich Heine, very important names in German literature, all of that brought out here. A blatant disregard for this history and the impact of literature, completely destroyed, certainly demonstrating one of the first public acts of the Nazis imposing their ideology on the German public. Certainly the liveliest square here in Berlin today, a square called Pariser Platz. The reason why we've got so much attention here is because of the very large structure that you see behind me, and that being the Brandenburg Gate. And the Brandenburg Gate is decidedly the symbol of Berlin in terms of the city's identity. It's a structure that dates back to the year 1791, and this was just one of several entries to the old city of Berlin. Now granted, there has always been a gate here at this location, just that back at the end of the 1780s, that's when the neoclassical era really arrived here to the city. The king at that time, a man by the name of Friedrich Wilhelm II, really wanted to have a gate that would send the right message, one that would be a much more lavish gate, as this was the one that he was using on a daily basis. And so they decided to go ahead and replace that existing gate with this one here, and the gate has been left standing throughout the city ever since. Now, as you can imagine, the Brandenburg Gate has gone through several different transformations throughout history. This was the old royal gate, which makes it the most significant out of all the entries to the city. You can see 6 large columns here in front of the gate. The 2 middle columns there provided larger space, and that larger space was reserved for the family. Once you went on the other side of the Brandenburg Gate, then you're outside the old city, and you're in the Tiergarten, the royal hunting grounds belonging to the royal family, today simply known as Berlin's Central Park. And back in the 1840s, as the city began to take down the old city wall, as well as other gates that would make way or make access into town and make way for folks heading out of town, these infrastructural plans didn't really apply too much of this part of town. They were preparing the city for different roads, different railways that were going to be built. These infrastructural plans didn't really apply to too much of this part of town. And because the Brandenburg Gate was still being used by the royal family, they decided to go ahead and leave the gate standing, and the gate has stuck with the city ever since. Now, back in the 1930s, this is the site right here during Hitler's Third Reich that became very infamous between 1933 and all the way up to the end of the Second World War. As this is the site right here where those large parades that the Nazis would stage through the center of the city would oftentimes begin. In fact, one of the largest parades that they would stage here would occur back in 1940 during the Second World War, just after France had fallen to the Third Reich. Those German troops that marched into Paris came back here just weeks later for one very large military celebration. If you had been here back in the summer of 1940, right here at this very spot, here's what you would have seen. Now, as a result of the 12 years of National Socialism, as a result of the Nazis and their imperial plans to take over the rest of Europe, 70% of the city center lay in ruins in May of 1945, including all the beautiful buildings that were once situated on this square, except for one structure that actually survived, that of course being the Brandenburg Gate. Despite some damage on either side of the gate itself was still intact. Now, I've got a photo here from May of 1945 that shows you here a group of Soviet soldiers sitting and standing here in the middle of the square, right here where you're standing today. And in the background, you can see the Brandenburg Gate. So it did survive. And let me also add, it was nothing short of a miracle that it did survive. So for that reason then, in the 1950s, both East and West Berlin governments got together to restore it. But as we said before, it was in 1961 that the Berlin Wall was built. And the Berlin Wall used to stand just on the other side of the Brandenburg Gate. If you had been here 24 years ago on this day, back in January of 1989, right here at this very spot, this is what you would have seen. Absolutely nothing here. Folks, if you come up here just a little bit closer, I want to point out a few things. This whole open area is where these very modern-looking buildings are standing today. 68,000 tons of bombs dropped in the city between 1940 and 1945 in over 350 air raids. If you took every single air raid and added it up, this would equal 15 months of total bombing. It took nearly 15 years to clean this city up. The last dump trucks left with the last rubble in the year 1960. Starting right here, what was once a very prominent, very exciting, and certainly one of the most historical parts of town, completely washed away from the Second World War. Furthermore, in 1961, the East German government built its wall going down to the center of the city so that its citizens in communist East Berlin could not get over into that island of democracy of West Berlin. Now, And most places throughout town, a West Berliner could go right up to and touch the wall, graffiti on it if he wanted to. That was all right. But back in the East, an East German could not. That's because right here before the Berlin Wall, the East German government cleared out a no man's land that became known as the Death Strip. This was a patrolled area where 24 hours a day you'd have East German guards walking up and down along the wall here with machine guns strapped over their shoulder, making sure that nobody would be able to get up that close to the wall to escape. You also would have had a series of tripwires, signal fences, police dogs that were trained to attack anything that moved. Very lethal obstacles over which you would have had to come if you had decided to try to escape. Basically, the East German government didn't want you to go into your garage, grab a ladder, for example, bring that ladder up to the wall, lay it against the wall, climb up the ladder, and jump over the wall to go to the west. By patrolling this area just before the wall, they were preventing that from happening. And I think what the most disturbing feature here to this security is that it was consistent all 155 kilometers around the wall. Now, for those of you who go on that I Spy tour tonight, you're going to go to the official wall memorial here in Berlin, and you're going to see a piece of that death strip, the only piece that is still being preserved here in this part of town. You'll not only talk about it more into detail, but also you'll talk about what it meant for the individual of East Germany who had to live behind the wall. So certainly a very interesting tour this evening if you do decide to go on that. So as you can see, the Brandenburg Gate stood right next here to the wall, making it not only as inaccessible to anybody who came here during the 28 years that the wall stood, but it was also seen as a symbol of division between the two cities until the 9th of November 1989, which was the day that the wall fell. This coming after several months of peaceful protests and demonstrations all throughout East Germany, where the East German citizens themselves put an enormous amount of pressure on the East German government to relax its travel restrictions, which finally occurred on the 9th of November. And then over the next several days, that's when photos like these were taken just on the back side of the Brandenburg Gate, looking up here in our direction. You can see people standing on the wall, sitting on the wall, and anticipating and certainly preparing themselves for what would eventually become reunification between the two cities and the two German states less than a year later on October 3rd, 1990. And it's historical photos like these, iconic photos like these, that really helped make the Brandenburg Gate today seen as a symbol of German reunification. So, all the buildings that you see around us here were all put up after the reunification. Reconstruction here in this part of town began in the mid-1990s. You can see we've got the French Embassy over here dating back to 2003. And the last building to be built on this square is the American Embassy just over here dating back to 2008. That is to say, folks, when the city was finally done rebuilding from the Second World War in this particular part of town was in the year 2008. Another vivid demonstration as to how present that Second World War was here in this city. But this really encapsulates a lot of what you'll find here in the city center of Berlin today. You can see how the city has taken what is left of old Berlin, combined it then with new Berlin to create a very interesting setting that you don't see in many other parts of Europe today. Where we are right now is at the official memorial dedicated to the murdered Jews of Europe, also known as the Holocaust Memorial. Now, back at the beginning of the 1990s, just after the fall of the wall and just after the reunification, there was a lot of international attention that was coming into this city. A lot of different eyes are focused in from all over the world to see how East and how West were going to come together and how they were going to start making decisions for their future under a reunified government. So what the politicians then at that time knew was that it would be a key moment to do something positive with all of that international attention, to sort of take it a step further, to do something to show the world and to show their own people that one of their first priorities of the reunification was to confront this history and pay tribute to a group of individuals that lost their lives as a result of this history at the national level. The only problem, though, at that time was coming up with how. And more specifically, with what. In other words, what on earth could you possibly design? What on earth could you possibly construct that could truly stand for the enormity of such atrocities? Well, what you see right here are 2,711 of these concrete blocks. And this is the work of a New York architect, a man by the name of Peter Eisenman, who's also Jewish and who also realized that there was just nothing that anybody could possibly design that could truly stand for the enormity of such crimes. And so therefore then it's been said that the intention behind this memorial was to create something that would be totally abstract. Eisenman held an interview not long after this was completed in 2005, and during that interview he said, quote, "The enormity of the Holocaust is such that any attempt to recognize it by traditional means is inevitably inadequate. Our memorial offers a new type of remembrance, a remembrance that is distinct from nostalgia." In other words, what that means is that the idea has been left up to you, the individual, to come to this memorial. The idea has been left up to you to stand here, observe it, ask yourself questions, walk around here, try to come up with your own interpretations, and find out what this memorial means to you. This is why when you walk around the entire memorial here, you won't find any sort of information that gives you any sort of indication about its design. There's no information here even on how to approach the memorial, which has actually been a bit controversial because unless if you talk to somebody who knows about the memorial, a lot of people come here and they're like, well, you know, what the heck is this thing? Come to this memorial with all the information that you have ever had on this period of history, the Holocaust. And ask yourself, for example, who could have Eisenman been thinking about when he designed the memorial to have its blocks be very small and very scattered here at the outskirts, here at the beginning of the memorial? What could that possibly represent? Why is it that when I look down here into the middle of the memorial, all of a sudden, once you make your way into the center of the memorial, these blocks, they start to become much taller. It starts to look more organized. It starts to look more structured. And especially if I stand next to one of these blocks, it really begins to feel imposing. What could that possibly mean? When you're walking through it, you find yourself, if you look to your left, you look to your right, behind you, straight on, you always see that there's a way out of here. And all the while, you're making your way down and up, down and up. The ground is very uneven. What could that mean? Maybe you are able to come up with these different interpretations. Maybe you are able to come up with these different reasons for its design. Then again, maybe all it is to you is just a bunch of blocks here sitting in the heart of Berlin. That's the whole point here, folks. There is no correct interpretation because each interpretation is going to be and should be something different for everyone. Now, right over here, you can see that we've got an information center. What you do is you go down the stairs underneath the memorial, and it's underneath the memorial here that you can find out more information about the Holocaust and even listen to interviews given by Holocaust survivors. So the idea then is to refresh your memory on this period of history, come upstairs here with some of those stories from those people who lived this history firsthand, come out here, let all that mesh together, walk around here to come up with those different interpretations. Unfortunately, as it is Monday, it is closed today. However, there is another memorial, another information center that I will be pointing out a little bit later, which you can also make your way into if you want to get more information about this, and then take that information and bring it back here to try to, come up with interpretations and walk around here. Good. Oh, by the way, the number of blocks here, 2,711. It's a very specific number. But actually, that number has absolutely no significance to anything whatsoever. That's just the number that was ended at. And if you take a look at all these blocks here, they all look the same in terms of their color, in terms of the material that was used to make them, but actually, no two blocks here are the same. One block might be just a little bit taller than another block. One block might be positioned at some type of an angle that somehow makes it different from all other blocks. So in other words, each block here is its own. After all the bureaucratic work was finally finished, work began here on the 1st of April 2003. It took about a year and a half to build. It was finally finished in December of 2004, but wasn't actually handed over to the public and opened officially until May of 2005, which marked the 60th anniversary of VE Day, Allied victory in Europe and the end of the Second World War here in Europe.